They made her undress in public, an act that would humiliate anyone. The desert heat was unforgiving, but nothing was as scorching as the contempt she felt from the soldiers surrounding her. They smirked and whispered as she unzipped her coveralls, the harsh sound of metal teeth scraping against the fabric punctuating the quiet desert air. It wasn't a routine inspection. It wasn't even a legitimate order. No, this was something far worse. A game they were playing, and she was the target. She could feel their eyes on her, their judgment. One soldier raised his phone, pretending to check the time, but making sure to catch her every movement. The crude laughter that followed made it clear. They didn't care for her, didn't respect her, and didn't consider her worth anything more than the object they saw before them. As she turned, ready to continue with her task, a strange shift happened. The cipher on her waist, a subtle yet undeniable mark, came into full view. It wasn't a tattoo. It wasn't some careless inked decoration. It was a symbol that commanded respect and fear in equal measure. The unit commander froze, the smile vanishing from his face, replaced with an uneasy tension. The air around them seemed to shift. The soldiers' smirks faltered, their whispers stilled. It wasn't just a woman they were dealing with anymore. It was someone far more powerful than they had imagined. In that instant, everything changed. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. This is a story you'll remember long after the sound fades. The harsh desert sun beat down on the staging area, turning the ground beneath into a furnace of dust and diesel fumes. It was 1,000 hours, and already, the air was thick with heat waves that shimmered above the hoods of armored vehicles. The metal surfaces were too hot to touch, their shine dulled by the unrelenting sun. Everywhere, soldiers were busy, preparing for the next phase of the operation, but the atmosphere felt heavy, as though something was about to break. Layla Roar moved through it all with ease, her boots crunching against the gravel as she walked with the steady, unhurried pace of someone who'd spent years in worse places. She didn't hurry. She didn't falter. Every step was a testament to experience. Years spent in environments like this, where the sun never set, and the threats were always just around the corner. Her coveralls hung loose on her frame, not for comfort, but for practicality. The muscles in her arms weren't from vanity, but from necessity, earned through countless hours of hard work and survival. Her dark hair, pulled back in a regulation bun, was streaked with gray, a sign of age and experience in a place that demanded both. Her boots, steel-toed and well-worn, told stories of every step she'd taken, from concrete to sand, and on surfaces that didn't officially exist. On the chest of her coveralls, the name tape read Lore. But there were no rank insignias, no unit patches. To the untrained eye, she was just another contractor, part of the sea of uniforms that seemed to blend together in the dust of the base. But the soldiers lounging under the shade of a nearby trailer saw her as something else, an outsider, someone who didn't belong. As Layla approached the first vehicle on her inspection list, the murmurs of the soldiers died down. Eyes followed her, and though their attention seemed casual, it wasn't. It never was. Layla crouched beside the Humvee, her fingers brushing over the suspension mountings, feeling for any signs of wear or damage. The vehicle was covered in desert camouflage, its paint worn thin by the sun and sand. The manifest said it was cleared for deployment, but something about the way it sat, too low in the back, raised a warning flag in her mind. It didn't feel right. There was more weight than the paperwork accounted for, and the last thing she wanted was to miss something crucial. She pulled out a small flashlight and began inspecting the suspension, her focus unwavering. She had done this 1,000 times before, in conditions far worse than this. But today, there was something different. Behind her, a shadow fell across her work area. Layla looked up and found a young private standing just a few feet away, his eyes fixed on her with the kind of intensity that meant one thing. He'd been told to keep an eye on her. "You need something, soldier?" Layla asked, keeping her tone even, the calm of someone who had been in this position countless times before. The private shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure of how to proceed. "Just making sure you have everything you need, ma'am," he replied, his voice lacking the confidence of someone who truly understood what was going on. "You ever worked on vehicle suspension before?" Layla asked, her gaze moving back to the axle housing. The private hesitated. "No, ma'am. I'm infantry." Layla didn't miss a beat. "Then you might want to take a look at this." She pointed to the mounting brackets, where the metal had bent slightly, creating stress fractures. "That's what happens when you overload a vehicle beyond its design specs." Morrison crouched down next to her, now genuinely curious. "Is that bad?" Layla didn't sugarcoat it. "Bad enough to get you killed if it fails during a convoy run." The young private went pale, his fingers shaking as he traced the crack with his own eyes. "Should I report this?" "I'm going to," Layla replied calmly. "But someone authorized these modifications. Someone who thought they knew better than the engineers who designed this system." The tension in the air thickened as the sound of boots crunching in the gravel signaled the arrival of Staff Sergeant Beckett. His posture was rigid, arms crossed in front of his chest, an expression that said he was ready for confrontation. Layla could see his eyes narrow as he scanned the vehicle, the private now standing nervously at attention behind him. "What's the problem here, sweetheart?" Beckett's voice was laced with that arrogant confidence that came with rank, the kind of tone that only someone who had never truly been tested could afford to use. Layla stood up slowly, wiping the dirt from her hands as she met his gaze. "The suspension has been modified. Recent work, not logged in the maintenance records." Beckett's lips curled into a smirk. "And you would know that because you're the expert on military vehicles? I've been inspecting military vehicles longer than you've been in uniform," Layla replied coolly, her voice unwavering. "I know exactly what I'm looking at." One of the privates snorted behind him, clearly enjoying the exchange. "Big talk for someone who doesn't even rate a uniform," he muttered, barely loud enough for Layla to hear. Layla's eyes never left Beckett's. She was unshaken. "I earned my stripes in places your security clearance doesn't reach." The insult hung in the air for a moment, but Beckett only grinned, stepping closer, clearly trying to intimidate her. "Sure you did. Desk job in some rear echelon motor pool, stamping papers, pretending to know what soldiers really do." Layla didn't flinch. She was calm, composed, professional. "This vehicle fails inspection. Unauthorized modifications. No documentation. I'm grounding it until someone with actual authority can explain why the rear suspension's been reinforced for a combat load." Beckett's smile faltered, but his pride wasn't ready to back down. "You don't have the authority to ground anything. You're a contractor. You make suggestions, not decisions. I suggest you explain why your vehicle's been modified to carry twice its rated load without proper documentation." Layla shot back. Beckett's jaw tightened. Behind him, the privates exchanged uneasy glances. The tension was palpable. They had all expected an easy game, something to pass the time, but now things had shifted. They were dealing with someone who actually knew what they were doing, and it was clear that Beckett was losing control. Beckett stood frozen, his jaw clenched tight, his pride and authority slipping further out of his grasp. The quiet tension in the air was shattered by the distant rumble of approaching engines. Low and throaty, the sound of military vehicles cutting through the desert. Before the convoy had fully stopped, Colonel Arthur May stepped out of the lead vehicle, his desert camouflage uniform dark with sweat, his expression hard as stone. Two military police flanked him, their hands resting casually on their sidearms, the weight of their presence heavy with intent. May took in the scene with one quick sweep. The half-dressed woman, the soldiers gathered around with phones out, the fuel bay alarm still blaring its electronic shriek, And then his eyes landed on the cipher burned into Layla's skin. His face went ashen, blood draining from it in an instant. "Jesus Christ," he whispered so quietly that only the people closest to him could hear. Then louder he demanded, "What the hell is going on here?" Beckett snapped to attention, his previously unshakable confidence evaporating in a heartbeat. "Sir, conducting a routine safety inspection following a fuel bay alert. The contractor may have tampered with." His words faltered when Colonel May's eyes locked onto the cipher on Layla's back. Mace's voice, deep and calm, cut through the confusion. "Stand down, Sergeant." The atmosphere shifted again, the soldiers now stepping back, instinctively knowing that this was no ordinary inspection. The tension of the moment, which had seemed so trivial moments before, was suddenly laden with far greater implications. The cipher, an insignia that meant far more than any soldier had initially understood, was a symbol of elite, off-the-record operations, the kind that went beyond ordinary military procedures. Layla wasn't just some contractor. She was someone the government couldn't afford to acknowledge. Someone who had been buried under classified protocols for a reason. May stepped closer, his expression now one of quiet recognition, his gaze never leaving the cipher. "Ma'am," he said softly, "you can get dressed." Layla nodded, the weight of the situation settling over her. There was no anger, no fear in her movements. She pulled her coveralls back up with the same precise, deliberate motion she had used to remove them. The soldiers watched in stunned silence, the shame of their earlier behavior settling heavily in their chests. Beckett took a step forward, his hands raised in a failed attempt at authority, but his earlier confidence had dissolved entirely. "I was just following procedure," he muttered, trying to salvage his position. Mace turned toward him, his voice low and cutting. "Sergeant Beckett, you're under arrest for abuse of authority and violation of classified personnel protocols." The words hit like a punch. The military police moved forward, swiftly and without hesitation. Beckett, realizing the gravity of the situation, stepped back, his hands still raised in surrender, but it was too late. The soldiers dispersed in silence, the tension in the air slowly dissipating. They had witnessed something that would remain etched in their minds long after the incident was over. The carefree chatter and crude jokes had been replaced by a sobering realization. Competence demanded respect, not rank. The lesson had been learned the hard way, but it had been learned nonetheless. Layla stood by the fuel bay, her clipboard still in hand, her mind focused on the task at hand. Despite the chaos, she resumed her inspection without hesitation, as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The hum of activity around her began to return to normal, but it was different now. The soldiers no longer treated her as just another contractor, no longer underestimated her because of her lack of visible rank. They had seen firsthand the power of quiet strength, the kind that didn't need to boast or command attention. As the last of the soldiers returned to their duties, Colonel May approached her once more, his face now softened with respect. "You could have identified yourself earlier," he said, his tone carrying the weight of someone who had seen countless situations unravel, and yet still appreciated the quiet dignity of this one. "It could have saved a lot of trouble." Layla shook her head slightly, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "My cover is more important than my pride," she replied simply. The words hung in the air for a moment, their meaning clear to anyone who had ever been forced to play the long game. "You nearly got yourself assaulted," Mace said softly, the concern for her well-being clear now that the tension had passed. Layla's eyes met his, steady and calm. "I've survived worse," she said quietly, the simplicity of the statement carrying all the weight of her past experiences. She had faced far greater dangers than the one she had just overcome, and as she finished her inspection, a quiet respect settled over the base. The lesson had been learned, but the true change was in how the soldiers would treat the civilians who walked among them. Not as outsiders, but as equals. As Layla packed up her tools and walked toward the gate, the atmosphere on the base had shifted. The soldiers, once quick to judge, now looked at the civilians who came through with newfound respect. They had seen the strength that quiet competence could bring, and they understood now that true power didn't always announce itself loudly. Morrison, the young private who had once been unsure, caught up to her as she passed through the gate. "Ma'am," he said, his voice filled with sincerity, "thank you for everything today. You taught me what real leadership looks like." Layla smiled, the faintest trace of pride in her eyes. "Real leadership is about protecting those who can't protect themselves," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "Remember that when you make sergeant." As she walked away, the base returned to its usual rhythm, but something had changed. The soldiers had learned the hardest lesson. Respect was earned through competence, not ego. Have you ever seen someone underestimated because they chose to stay quiet? Let us know in the comments. If this story left you inspired, hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful stories. Share this with someone who knows what it's like to be underestimated.